Hey, what's up everyone? Hope you're all having a great day. The support role is a popular topic of discussion in the Overwatch community. The general sentiment seems to lean towards the opinion that support is too strong. We can see evidence for this sentiment in things like the queue times between roles. Queue times are an approximation of role popularity. The larger the difference between queue times for each role, the larger the difference in demand. The difference is not particularly problematic for most players, but I do find that it's most visible in the competitive playlist above Diamond. The most extreme I've seen it is a difference of almost 15 minutes between estimated tank and support queues, but the majority of the time it's not that bad. The support role is the target of much of the community's grievances. Some criticisms I think are valid, but sometimes I do think the role can also be treated a bit unfairly. In particular, I have seen people talk about the role as if support is just super easy to play. While I wouldn't outright disagree, I think it depends on what we're talking about. I think it's fair to say that the support role has a significantly lower barrier of entry or skill floor than the other roles. If Overwatch is your first FPS and you're still trying to get used to moving around, then I think support has some good options that at least allow you to interact with the game. In addition, I think there is an argument to be made that playing the role decently at your average skill level can be relatively easy compared to the other roles because of the high-value utility abilities that many supports have, which allow them to secure value at the press of a button. Whereas you could say that damage and tank heroes need to put in a bit more effort in order to secure a similar amount of value. On the other hand, I think playing the support role well is a different story. Trying to keep your entire team alive, while also trying to weave in damage, while also managing your cooldowns, while also surviving against the enemy team who really wants to kill you, is not that easy. On support, you have to worry about 9 other players simultaneously, rather than just 5. And so if you want to play the role well, you will have to learn how to manage a lot of things at once. While support may have a low skill floor, I think it actually has a very high skill ceiling as well. So I think it can be unfair to generalize an entire role as being easy just because it has a lower barrier of entry. That being said, I think there is a discussion to be had about whether a role should have such a high potential to begin with. While we should have respect for great support players who are capable of managing all of their responsibilities at the same time, a big point of disagreement is whether the role should have so many significant responsibilities in the first place. Many players argue that the support role simply does too much. Non-support players feel like they're just puppets living in the support player's world. While putting it this way is probably a bit overdramatic, I don't think the general sentiment is necessarily unfounded. Indeed, it's hard to argue that support players don't have a lot of potential, since they're equipped with great damage potential, great utility, great damage mitigation, and of course great healing. And any one of these, or perhaps all of these, are commonly cited as the reason for supports being problematic. A common argument made by damage/DPS players is that the ability for supports to deal damage is the main problem. And of course it's understandable why this argument is made. If the whole point of the damage role is to do damage, and yet an entire other role does it almost just as well, what's the point of the damage role in the first place? If damage heroes do damage, and support heroes do damage among other things, then aren't supports just straight up better damage heroes? I definitely see where this argument comes from, but I'm hesitant to 100% agree because there is an argument to be made that damage heroes still do have some things that make the role unique. In particular, the damage role in general still has higher overall sustained damage and also has access to high burst damage abilities, which the support role lacks. A big weakness of the argument is that the other role, namely tank, also does plenty if not more damage, and yet damage players do not usually complain about tank being a problem, specifically because they do damage. That being said, I don't fault damage players for feeling like the role lacks identity. In open queue, for example, it's evident that damage heroes don't really have as much of a place, because given no role restrictions, tanks are kind of just damage heroes with more health, and supports are kind of just damage heroes with more healing, and so having a pure damage hero on your team in an objective-based game isn't super impactful. Sometimes the complaint about support is not necessarily about the DPS numbers specifically, but rather the support kits enabling better dueling potential compared to the damage heroes. Recently, a relatively well-known and perhaps somewhat infamous DPS player who goes by the name Metro posted a clip of him trying to 1v1 a Kiriko. The basic purpose of the clip is to suggest that it is ridiculous for a support to be able to easily 1v1 a damage hero like Soldier. Whether or not the clip actually shows that, I'll leave for someone else to discuss. But the important thing is that the basic idea of the clip has received a lot of support from others in the community who agree with the notion that supports are too strong at dueling. It's hard to argue that supports aren't great duelists. While they lack the offensive abilities of the damage heroes, they make up for it in their defensive abilities. And it is precisely those abilities that make it very frustrating because they actually enable supports to play much more aggressively than damage heroes, who have to worry about things like cover and positioning. Specifically, with abilities like Kiriko's TP, it seems to allow Kiriko to freely engage in duels without much risk to herself, since if she starts to lose the duel, she can simply safely disengage and try again later, whereas many damage heroes do not have such freedoms, or at the very least, need to play very passively after using their defensive cooldowns. Meanwhile, Kiriko can continue to provide a lot of value to her team even after disengaging from a lost fight. It's clear that the support design philosophy is geared towards giving them ways to fight back, and strictly speaking, there isn't anything that says that damage heroes have to be the best duelists in the game. I do understand that that sounds pretty lame to most DPS players, but we also have to consider the fact that support heroes cannot just engage in duels for free. And in fact, roughly half of the team's healing is sacrificed, and probably also some very important cooldowns, every time a support duels a damage hero. And so I can see an argument being made in favor of supports having strong dueling potential. Another point of contention is that the problem with the support role is their utility and survivability. A problem that's commonly, though not exclusively, cited by tank players. A tank's job, described most simply, is to create space for their team, and oftentimes tanks create space by trying to threaten the enemy supports. It's perhaps the case that as the game has progressed, much of the support roster is increasingly able to negate tank aggression through damage mitigation, movement, and crowd control abilities, and perhaps the removal of a second tank has now caused the now singular tank to feel the effects of these abilities twice as often. It's intuitive that burning enemy support cooldowns is a legitimate form of value, but it's not a form of value that feels particularly fun and engaging, especially if it doesn't directly lead to getting eliminations yourself as a tank. As a tank, you can end up feeling very dependent on your team, because by the time you've done enough to make the enemy vulnerable, you no longer have the cooldowns or resources to finish the job yourself, and so you feel like you're playing a game of whack-a-mole with too many moles. I'm of the opinion that there probably is a real balance problem when it comes to the tank role, but maybe there's also a perceptual problem, and the support players are right. Tank players just don't understand their role, and they're just supposed to be damage sponges as the name of the role suggests, and if they don't like that, then too bad. I have seen that some players genuinely do think this way, and I would have to disagree. Of course, we don't want a game where tanks can just freely walk into the backline, assassinate a helpless support, and walk out. But at the same time, we still want a game where tanks can feel like their plays matter, instead of feeling like they're forced to deal with 90% of everything that's annoying about the enemy team. We've all heard the slogan, support not healer, and maybe we need another one called tank not shield. We understood with support that it feels bad if the only thing you can do is heal all game. And equivalently for tanks, it feels bad if the only thing you can do is absorb damage and cooldowns. I think some players may be genuinely confused at the suggestion that tanks are somehow weak compared to supports, and may even think that tanks are overpowered. Meanwhile, people keep talking about how tank sucks to play. I think the friction in this discussion has a lot to do with the natural differences in experience within the skill distribution. In lower ranks, players generally have a harder time figuring out how to keep themselves alive, and so tanks are particularly overwhelming for non-tanks because of their health pools. In higher ranks, players generally understand the limitations of the tank role due to their more niche playstyles, and so are familiar with how to shut them down or avoid them entirely, which results in tank players feeling like the role is weak or boring to play. Whether the game should be balanced around low or high elo is a discussion for a different day, but this is one of the reasons that the quote-unquote tank problem is difficult to address through numbers alone. When tank numbers are high, non-tank players feel like they're playing Dead by Daylight, and when tank numbers are low, tank players feel like they're playing Euro Truck Simulator. If you play tank enough, eventually you'll most likely run into the scenario of trying to kill two supports pocketing each other, a task that oftentimes feels almost impossible, while simultaneously watching your own supports die over and over again. You might think that I'm going to say that tanks should always be able to 1v2 supports, and no, that's not what I'm saying. Rather, I think we should ask, why does the success of the entire team depend so greatly on the performance of only two of its members? The infamous tank diff is the most commonly cited issue among teams, but in my opinion, the support diff is highly underrated, and often not obvious if you're only looking at the in-game stats. Another argument you might hear is that the problem with the support role is the healing itself. Some players hold the opinion that healing numbers need to be brought down across the board, and that doing so would result in more engaging gameplay as eliminations would come more easily. We've likely all been in situations where it feels like nothing on the enemy team is dying, and sometimes this problem is just because of poor gameplay, but it can also be attributed to supports who are capable of pumping so much healing that it negates all the damage being done. As the game has gone on, supports are said to have received healing creep, accompanied with more abilities to save teammates, and so naturally it's harder to secure a kill without coordinated focus fire or one-shots. If you can't 0 to 100 an enemy's health bar, they'll likely get healed to full before you're even halfway through your reload. It makes the other non-support roles feel much more dependent on the supports to enable them. If the enemies get hard-pocketed by their supports, but your own supports don't pocket you, then it forces you to play much more passively. And in addition, it can make support players feel like they have to heal bot in order to counter enemies who heal bot. Heal botting is definitely not the best way to play support, but if you're not super confident with your mechanics, it can be kind of difficult to justify trying to do anything else when spamming heals already gets so much value with much less margin for error. Interestingly, it may not be the actual healing numbers themselves that result in what feels like increased healing, but rather it's possible that the simple addition of the support regen passive is to blame. With automatic health regen, supports have more healing uptime and are able to focus most of their healing abilities on their teammates, and so as a result, everyone else has more sustain overall. Having discussed all these apparent issues, it's hard to argue that support isn't strong, but at the same time, I would be hesitant to just call for a straightforward nerf to the role. I think it's fair to say that we shouldn't want the support role to just be a glorified mobile health pack, and allowing supports the flexibility to be able to survive and do damage on their own gives the role more agency, and therefore makes the role more fun and engaging to play. Maybe the main quote-unquote problem with support isn't actually a problem with support itself, but rather a problem of agency with the damage and tank roles. With support, we realize that agency makes the game more fun, and the same is probably true of the other roles as well. Perhaps it's time to consider giving the other roles the same kind of agency we've granted to the support role, and giving tank and damage the ability to rely less on supports. It sounds crazy, but perhaps the best way to do this might even be to start giving damage and tank heroes some ability to heal themselves, whether it be through some kind of regen passive or some kind of active ability similar to Soldier's Biotic Field. There could be concerns that blurring the lines between roles would be something that removes the uniqueness and identity of each individual role, and eliminates some of the importance of team play, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Team play will still exist and be important regardless of how the roles are designed. After all, games that do not have roles or even heroes have interesting forms of team play as well. Ultimately, while Overwatch is a team game, the vast majority of its gameplay occurs in a solo queue setting, rather than in a coordinated team setting, and so I think it makes sense to reward individual play over team play. When it came to the support role, giving more options, such as allowing support heroes to do more damage, actually made the role more interesting to play. And more importantly, it made the role more appealing to play for a larger portion of the player base. And I would say that DPS supports don't take away from the identity of the support role as the quote-unquote healing role. I think if we do something similar to the other roles, giving access to more forms of self-sustain that don't rely on supports, it would make the other roles feel more interesting to play as well. Agency is generally a good thing, and only giving it to one role is exactly what removes some of the identity from the other roles or makes them feel comparatively worse to play. To end off, I do think sometimes the issue of supports can be over-exaggerated, and while I do think support is indeed very strong compared to the other roles, I wouldn't go as far as to say that the other roles are somehow unplayable. There are some specific interactions like anti-nade on tanks that I think are worthy of being addressed, but for the most part I'm not of the opinion that support is somehow broken. I lean more towards the idea that the other roles need more rather than support heroes needing less. And by more or less, I don't necessarily mean strength, but rather flexibility, giving certain heroes more tools to deal with more things and therefore make them less vulnerable to certain weaknesses. I would definitely agree that the support role has some of the more annoying abilities in the game, things like Suzu, Immortality Field, Resurrect, Life Grip, etc. And they're of course annoying because they negate your value at the press of a button. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that an ability being annoying makes it broken. Maybe they still do deserve a rework for the sake of making them less annoying to play against. But at the end of the day, there will always be abilities that are going to be at least a little bit frustrating. Support gets blamed a lot for the game's apparent issues, and like with most issues, although they are real, the severity is probably overstated by the community. Over the years, the design philosophy for support has evolved, and maybe it's time we consider evolving the design philosophy of the other roles as well. And that's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think about the state of the support role. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.